Jacob Ludwig Felix Mendelssohn-Bartholdy was born into luxury and stayed a part of the affluent middle class for his entire life. Both well off, his parents gave him and his siblings the very best education that money could buy. A polyglot, polymath, his intellectual and artistic pursuits, embracing music, drawing, painting, poetry, classical studies, and theology, were second to none among the great composers. His musical precocity in composition, piano, violin, and viola, not to mention conducting, was rivaled only by Mozart. One of the best keyboard virtuosi of his time, his extemporaneous performances were legend. He was the most distinguished organist of the century since J.S. Bach. He was a main mover in the German Bach revival, conducting the first performance of Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, the first performance of the all but forgotten masterpiece outside of Leipzig. He revolutionized the new profession of conducting by taking up a baton and assuming full leadership of the orchestra, previously split by the concertmaster and the Kapellmeister. His compositions towed the line between the poles of classicism and romanticism, and Robert Schumann labeled him the Mozart of the 19th century. Even though he was baptized and a practicing Christian his whole life, his family's Jewish roots led to his almost full erasure from his death to the Second World War. Only in the 20th century, his genius was rediscovered and brought back into the classical music canon. Felix Mendelssohn was born on February 3, 1809, in Hamburg, at the time an independent city-state. The family fled Hamburg in the dead of the night and moved to Berlin in 1811 in fear of French reprisal for the Mendelssohn Bank's role in breaking Napoleon's continental system blockade. Felix's grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn, was a well-known Jewish scholar and philosopher who espoused religious tolerance as a European ideal. Abraham Mendelssohn renounced the Jewish religion prior to Felix's birth. He and his wife decided not to have Felix circumcised in contravention of the Jewish tradition. Felix and his siblings were at first brought up without religious education, and on March 21, 1816, they were baptized in a private ceremony in the family's Berlin apartment by Reformed Protestant minister of the Jerusalem Church, at which time Felix was given the additional names Jacob Ludwig. Mendelssohn's father, Abraham, and his wife, Leah, were baptized in 1822 and formally adopted the surname Mendelssohn-Bartholdy, which they had used since 1812, for them and their children. Their baptism into the dominant religion of the region was seen as the greatest act of assimilation and gave their children a significant leg up in life. Mendelssohn used the name Mendelssohn-Bartholdy exclusively during his life. In Berlin, the Mendelssohns created an idyllic situation to raise their children, hiring the very best tutors from the intellectual life of Berlin. Mendelssohn began his piano studies with his mother at age 6, and then both he and his older sister Fanny studied with Ludwig Berger, who was himself a former student of Muso Clementi. They soon moved to the tutelage in composition and counterpoint with Carl Friedrich Zelter, the director of the Berliner Sing Academy, an influential music society with both an orchestra and a large chorus. Zelter was mainly influenced by the German Baroque traditions of figured bass, chorale, and counterpoint, stemming from the legacy of J.S. Bach, and impressed those techniques heavily on the Mendelssohns. This led to a lifelong fascination with the German Baroque style for Felix, including lionizing J.S. Bach. Mendelssohn collected rare Bach scores throughout his life and made an exacting study of all the early music manuscripts he could get his hands on. This made a large impression on the young composer, and he would use the Baroque style in his compositions for his entire life. Some of his compositions, including works for chorus, organ, piano, and orchestra, were completely in the German Baroque style and were indistinguishable from the rest of the period. Between the ages of 11 and 14, Mendelssohn composed over 100 works, including keyboard and chamber works, symphonies, concerti, Christian sacred choruses, lieder, and opera. He also pursued a rigorous classical education with his tutor Carl Hayes. This included 6 hours of Latin a week, 4 for Caesar and Ovid, 1 for grammar, and 1 for exercises, lessons in history, arithmetic, geography, and German conversation, 2 hours of violin lessons a week, and twice weekly lessons with Zelter. He also delved into poetry, crafting a mock epic about his brother Paul, with 450 verses and dactylic hexameter, a meter he encountered in Ovid. His musical relationship with his sister Fanny also flowered at this time. Felix would submit his compositions for critique, mercilessly striking passages that Fanny did not like. This connection was to remain between them until Fanny's death in 1847, just months before Felix. As an adolescent, his works were often performed at home with a private orchestra for the associates of his wealthy parents amongst the intellectual elite of Berlin. Frequent visitors to the salon organized by his parents at their home in Berlin included artists, musicians, and scientists. The musician Sarah Rothenberg has written of the household that Europe came to their living room. Most of Felix's juvenile compositions were premiered in these musical salons. At age 16, Mendelssohn wrote his string octet in E-flat major, a work which has been regarded as the marking of beginning of his maturity as a composer. This octet and his overture to Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, which he wrote a year later in 1826, are the best known of his early works. The overture is perhaps the earliest example of a concert overture, a piece not written deliberately to accompany a stage performance, but to evoke a literary theme and performance on a concert platform. This was a genre that became popular form in musical romanticism. Later, in 1843, Mendelssohn revisited Shakespeare's comedy by writing incidental music for the play, including the famous Wedding March. Let's look at the overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream. Mendelssohn famously created what was to be used in perpetuity as fairy music, dancing fast rhythms and haunting tonalities in the winds. While a romantic piece and atmosphere, the overture incorporates many classical elements, being cast in sonata form and shaped by regular phrasings and harmonic transitions. The work was written over 1 month in the summer of 1826 and was a seminal work in German Romanticism. The overture was premiered in Stettin on the 20th of February 1827 at a concert conducted by Karl Loewe. Mendelssohn had turned 18 just over 2 weeks earlier. He had to travel 80 miles through a raging snowstorm to get to the concert, which was his first public appearance. Let's hear the opening of the work with the iconic woodwind chords and the dancing fairy theme. In 1821, Zelter introduced Mendelssohn to his friend and correspondent Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, then in his 70s, who was greatly impressed by the child, leading to perhaps the earliest confirmed comparison with Mozart in the following conversation between Goethe and Zelter. Musical prodigies are probably no longer so rare, but what this little man can do in extemporizing and playing at sight borders on the miraculous, and I could not have believed it possible at so early an age. And yet you heard Mozart in his 7th year at Frankfurt, said Zelter. Yes, answered Goethe, but what your pupil already accomplishes bears the same relation to the Mozart of that time as the cultivated talk of a grown-up person bears to the prattle of a child. Mendelssohn was invited to meet Goethe on several later occasions and set a number of Goethe's poems to music. His other compositions inspired by Goethe include the overture Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage and the cantata Die Osterwalpurgisnacht. In 1829, with the backing of Zelter and the assistance of actor Edward Deverin, Mendelssohn arranged and conducted a performance in Berlin of Bach's St. Matthew's Passion. The project started as a small chorus rehearsing the work in the Mendelssohn household to explore the work and to disprove a skeptical assertion that Bach's music only offered a dry arithmetical sum. When the greatness of the work was realized by Deverin and Mendelssohn, they applied to Zelter for the support for a full public performance. The orchestra and choir for the performance were provided by the Berlin Sing Academy, with Mendelssohn conducting. Mendelssohn made slight changes in the text of the work, making the text more palatable to a more modern Christian sensibility. Thus, the Berliners and the audience were encouraged to discover in Bach's cerebral masterpiece the roots of their own German Protestant spirituality. The success of the performance, one of the very first since Bach's death and the first ever outside of Leipzig, was a central event in the revival of Bach's music in Germany and, eventually, throughout Europe. Bach's masterwork was seen as an emblem of the ideal Protestant artwork. It earned Mendelssohn widespread acclaim at the age of 20. It also led to one of the few explicit references which Mendelssohn made to his origins. To think that it took an actor and a Jew's son to revive the greatest Christian music for the world. Once the fervor of the Passion ebbed, Felix's father, Abraham, decided that it would be best to send Felix on a grand tour of Europe so he could develop context that might evolve into a steady position. Between 1829 and 1832, Felix traveled Europe, seeing England, Bavaria, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, and France. Felix richly illustrated letters and documents detailed an experience that ultimately reinforced his identity as a German musician. This trip was also his first season in England, an important city in his professional life. He ultimately made 10 different trips to England, and many of his major works were premiered on the island nation. On this first trip, after the social season ended, Felix went on a walking tour of Scotland with his friend Carl Klingman and was impressed with the oceanic surroundings. This trip inspired not only the Scottish Symphony, but the Hebrides Overture. After navigating between the islands of the Hebrides on a steamer, Mendelssohn wrote back to Berlin, "In order to make you understand how extraordinarily the Hebrides affected me, the following came to my mind there." The following was a draft and piano score of the opening of the Hebrides Overture, complete with orchestral cues and dynamics, nearly in complete form. The opening notes of the overture state the theme Mendelssohn wrote while visiting the cave, and is played initially by the violas, cellos, and bassoons. This lyrical theme, suggested of the power and stunning beauty of the cave, is intended to develop feelings of loneliness and solitude. It's another symphonic overture without attachment to a production. This time, it doesn't even have a plot associated with it, unlike the overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream. It more accurately can be called a tone poem, or a symphonic composition that, in a single movement, evokes a descriptive scene. It remains part of the classical music canon today, being played by orchestras all over the world. Let's hear the opening of the Hebrides Overture now. Thank you for joining me in this video about the life of Mendelssohn. If you'd like to learn more about Mendelssohn, I recommend the book that I took a lot of this video from, R. Larry Todd's Mendelssohn, A Life in Music. Like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more. What do you want to learn about next? Leave me a comment down below. You can also support the making of these videos on Patreon. I get no ad revenue due to the use of musical examples, so Patreon is a great way to show your support. The bibliography for this video can be found on my website, dominiqueroyam.com. Interested in seeing my process? I document it on social media, so follow me for more updates. Thanks again, and see you in my next video.